A savage betrayal destroyed a fragile actress in Hollywood's bloodiest divorce, branded a homewrecker by a ruthless wife. Gail Russell was dragged into a courtroom for the ultimate public humiliation. While she was publicly eviscerated, the cinematic hero John Wayne perjured himself to save his box office empire, throwing his chemically dependent co-star to the wolves. Her own studio pushed her onto the witness stand as a human shield, and the second the paparazzi tore her apart, they used a morality clause to execute her. The adulterous husband won a Presidential Medal of Freedom. The scapegoat starved to death at 36. The destruction of Gail Russell began on the factory floor, where her dependency was engineered. Republic Pictures was not Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. It did not traffic in prestige or high art. Located in the San Fernando Valley, Republic was the undisputed king of Poverty Row. It was a high-volume, low-margin industrial complex designed by its founder, Herbert Yates, to churn out cheap westerns, serials, and B-movies at a relentless pace. The business model relied entirely on speed. Sets were reused, scripts were recycled, actors were expected to hit their marks, deliver their lines on the first take, and move to the next setup. When Republic talent scouts discovered a teenage Gail Russell in the early 1940s, they acquired a highly lucrative aesthetic. She possessed a striking melancholic beauty, dark hair, wide, expressive eyes, and an inherent vulnerability that translated flawlessly onto celluloid. The executives immediately locked her into a standard ironclad 7-year contract. She became an asset on the Republic balance sheet, but there was a severe mechanical flaw in this newly acquired asset. Gail Russell suffered from a crippling clinical phobia of the camera. This was not standard stage fright. It was a severe neurological response to the physical environment of a film set. In the 1940s, a soundstage was a hostile physical space. To expose the film stock, the crew utilized massive carbon arc lamps that generated blistering heat, pushing the temperature well over 100 degrees. The heavy acoustic doors were sealed shut. Dozens of crew members, technicians, and executives stared at the actors from the darkness behind the lens. When Gail Russell was placed under these lights and the director called for action, her biological system shut down. The terror manifested physically. Her hands shook violently. She broke into cold sweats. Her stomach rejected food. Her vocal cords seized, reducing her dialogue to a terrified whisper. In a modern corporate environment, a severe panic disorder requires medical leave and psychiatric intervention. In the Republic Pictures factory of the 1940s, a panic attack was classified purely as a logistical delay. Time was the only currency Herbert Yates cared about. Every minute Gail spent hyperventilating in her dressing room drained capital from the daily production budget. The studio executives did not have the time, the budget, or the inclination to hire therapists. They needed a fast, cheap solution to stabilize the asset and keep the cameras rolling. They bypassed medical intervention and implemented a chemical one. The studio provided the alcohol. It began quietly. A handler or an assistant director would step into her dressing room and offer a small shot of vodka before a difficult scene. It was presented as a practical remedy, a quick way to steady her nerves. The results were immediate and highly profitable. The alcohol suppressed her central nervous system just enough to stop the physical trembling. A few ounces of liquor lowered her heart rate, allowing her to walk onto the set, face the blinding arc lamps, and deliver her lines without collapsing. The executives observed this chemical reaction and institutionalized it. They actively managed her intake. They supplied the liquor, turning a blind eye to the bottles in her dressing room, utilizing alcohol as a corporate anesthetic. They intentionally wired her nervous system to depend on a highly addictive depressant simply to survive a standard workday. Republic Pictures transformed a terrified teenager into a high-functioning alcoholic because purchasing cheap vodka was vastly more cost-effective than halting production. They engineered a perfect, inescapable loop of dependency. Gail required the alcohol to face the camera, and she required the camera to earn the paycheck that kept her off the streets. The studio owned the camera, and the studio supplied the cure for the terror it caused. She was trapped in a closed circuit of systemic medical abuse. This was her baseline reality when she was cast opposite John Wayne in the 1947 film Angel and the Bad Man. Gail Russell was 22 years old. She was isolated, perpetually sedated by her employers, and floating through the brutal machinery of the industry in a chemical haze. She possessed absolutely no defensive armor. She was the perfect, compliant target for a man whose entire career was built on the illusion of masculine protection. John Wayne was 39. He was the undisputed king of Republic Pictures and the primary financial engine of the studio. On screen, he was the unyielding force of justice, the solitary cowboy who rode into danger to protect the weak. Off screen, he was a pragmatic, highly calculating businessman who fiercely protected his public image. Wayne recognized Gail's profound vulnerability instantly on the set. The dynamic was completely asymmetrical. He possessed total control over the production. She could barely control her own breathing. He presented himself to her not as a predator, but as a paternal figure. He offered guidance. He protected her from aggressive directors. He provided a physical and emotional shield against the terrifying demands of the studio apparatus. To a woman suffering from severe clinical anxiety, a man like Wayne offered a desperate, intoxicating illusion of safety. But Wayne's protection was entirely conditional, and it was rooted in deep hypocrisy. He drew her into an affair knowing full well that he possessed a massive, highly volatile legal liability waiting for him off the lot. Wayne was married to Esperanza Baur. Esperanza was not a naive, submissive Hollywood wife. She was a former Mexican actress who understood the ruthless, transactional mechanics of power better than the executives who ran the studios. She married John Wayne in 1946, and their union was essentially a hostile corporate merger characterized by extreme emotional violence, heavy drinking, and mutual contempt. The power disparity between Esperanza Baur and Gail Russell was absolute. It had nothing to do with age. They were only 4 years apart. The disparity lay in their survival instincts. Gail was a fragile, chemically dependent employee. Esperanza was a shark. She was sharp, highly possessive, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. She viewed her marriage to John Wayne not as a romance, but as a controlling stake in a highly lucrative enterprise. She guarded her position as his legal wife with the ferocity of a board member defending against a hostile takeover. Esperanza operated with a cold, calculating logic. She employed private investigators. She monitored her husband's movements. The whispers of Wayne's affair with his terrified, alcoholic co-star reached her quickly. The standard Hollywood narrative often relies on the trope of the hysterical, violent wife, and Esperanza was certainly capable of physical violence. According to persistent industry records and police reports, the Wayne residence was a combat zone. On one specific occasion, when Wayne returned home late, smelling of alcohol and another woman, Esperanza stood waiting in the hallway with a loaded firearm. She aimed the gun at his chest. She had the physical opportunity to end his life, but Esperanza Baur did not pull the trigger. She lowered the weapon. She possessed the cold, rational intellect to understand the law of the Hollywood jungle. A bullet fired in anger would result in a murder charge. It would result in a highly publicized criminal trial, a potential prison sentence, and the immediate, permanent severance of her access to John Wayne's immense generating fortune. Violence was a tactical error. Esperanza put the gun away and picked up a telephone. She contacted the most vicious, highly connected divorce attorneys operating in Los Angeles. She realized that physical assault was inefficient. She did not need to shoot her husband, and she did not need to physically confront his mistress. She simply needed to feed them both into the legal machinery of the California court system. A divorce lawsuit executed with maximum publicity was a far superior weapon. It was legal, it was highly destructive, and it guaranteed a massive financial payout. Esperanza instructed her legal team to draft a complaint designed with surgical precision to inflict maximum psychological and professional damage. She would not file for a quiet, sealed separation based on irreconcilable differences. She intended to explicitly name Gail Russell in the legal filings. She intended to drag the affair out of the shadows, slap it onto the public record, and let the press execute the woman who had dared to threaten her corporate position. Gail Russell was heavily sedated and completely reliant on a man who prioritized his brand above all else. John Wayne was navigating the affair with the arrogance of an untouchable star, and Esperanza Baur was sitting quietly with her attorneys, finalizing the paperwork that would detonate both of their lives. In 1953, the trap snapped shut. Esperanza Baur did not confront her husband in the dead of night. She did not leak rumors to the gossip columnists. She bypassed the court of public opinion and went directly to a judge. She filed for divorce in the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, executing a legal strategy that was chilling in its precision. Esperanza did not file a quiet, sealed petition citing irreconcilable differences. That would have guaranteed a fast settlement, but it would have allowed John Wayne to keep his pristine image intact, and it would have allowed Gail Russell to escape unpunished. Esperanza demanded blood. She filed a highly publicized, explosive grievance citing extreme mental cruelty, and she explicitly named Gail Russell as the other woman. Naming Gail in the legal filings was a tactical masterstroke. In the legal architecture of the 1950s, this required the court to issue a subpoena. It transformed Gail Russell from an anonymous, whispered-about mistress into a legally mandated participant in the trial. It dragged her out of the protective shadows of her dimly lit apartment and forced her onto the public record. Esperanza understood the Hollywood studio system. She knew that every contract player at Republic Pictures was bound by a morals clause. This clause gave the studio the absolute unilateral right to terminate an employee if they became involved in a public scandal that offended the decency of the community. Esperanza knew that Republic executives were already growing tired of Gail's escalating alcoholism. By making Gail the centerpiece of a scandalous adultery trial, Esperanza was not just seeking revenge. She was handing the studio the legal ammunition they needed to fire her rival. She was executing a corporate assassination by proxy. When the process server arrived at Gail Russell's door and handed her the subpoena, her chemically managed reality shattered. The sheer cruelty of this legal maneuver lay in Russell's specific medical condition. She suffered from severe paralyzing camera phobia and agoraphobia. She was terrified of crowds. She was terrified of being observed. The studio had supplied her with alcohol to suppress her nervous system just enough to survive a controlled, heavily managed film set. Now, the legal system was ordering her to walk into a chaotic, uncontrolled environment packed with aggressive reporters and blinding paparazzi flashbulbs. Terrified, Gail begged Republic Pictures for legal protection. She was their contracted star, and she expected the studio fixers to shield her from the crossfire. Instead, Republic Pictures recognized a catastrophic threat to their primary cash cow, John Wayne. The executives delivered a brutal ultimatum. The studio ordered Gail to take the stand, deny the affair, and protect Wayne's upcoming blockbusters. They explicitly forced their most fragile, chemically dependent employee to act as a human shield for their most powerful star. On the day of her testimony, the physical deterioration of Gail Russell was evident to everyone in the room. She arrived at the courthouse flanked by lawyers she could barely afford, her body shaking so violently she struggled to walk unassisted. She was deprived of the alcohol that Republic Pictures had trained her body to rely on. She was thrust into the blinding glare of the paparazzi flashbulbs, triggering the exact biological panic the studio had spent years chemically suppressing. Inside the courtroom, the geography of power was clearly defined. Esperanza Baur sat at the plaintiff's table. She was immaculate, composed, and utterly cold. She was flanked by a team of elite, high-priced attorneys. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to shed a single tear. She sat back and watched her legal team dissect the private life of her rival with forensic brutality. They questioned Gail about her late-night meetings with John Wayne. They questioned her character. They subjected a fragile, severely ill woman to a relentless, legally sanctioned public humiliation. But the definitive act of cruelty in that courtroom did not come from the scorned wife. It came from the hero. John Wayne was present. He possessed the immense financial leverage and the industry influence required to stop the slaughter. He could have instructed his attorneys to settle the divorce quietly, outside the courtroom walls. He could have paid Esperanza millions of dollars to seal the records and strike Gail's name from the filings. In the unwritten code of Hollywood, powerful men bought the silence of their discarded wives to protect their assets, but a quiet settlement required an admission of guilt. It required Wayne to acknowledge that he was at fault. It required him to spend a massive portion of his fortune to protect a 29-year-old B-movie actress who was rapidly losing her commercial value. John Wayne looked at the financial calculus. He looked at his carefully constructed, highly lucrative public brand. He was the ultimate symbol of American masculinity. He was the cowboy who never lied, the soldier who never flinched, the moral pillar of a conservative nation. Admitting to a sordid affair with a vulnerable alcoholic co-star would shatter the illusion. It would alienate his core demographic. It would threaten his box office supremacy. Faced with a choice between protecting the woman he had compromised and protecting his corporate empire, the cinematic hero made his decision. He chose the empire. John Wayne took the witness stand. He sat under oath facing the judge, the jury, and the assembled press, and he perjured himself in the court of public opinion. With absolute chilling confidence, Wayne swore that he had never engaged in a romantic or physical relationship with Gail Russell. He gaslit the entire courtroom. He framed their late-night rendezvous as purely professional meetings. He claimed he was simply offering career advice to a struggling young actress. Then, he executed a flawless transfer of guilt. He did not just deny the affair, he played the victim. He testified that Esperanza was a deeply unstable, irrationally jealous woman who hallucinated infidelities. He painted his wife as a paranoid hysteric and positioned himself as the long-suffering, honorable husband caught in the crossfire of her delusions. By denying the relationship, John Wayne abandoned Gail Russell to the wolves. He severed the only lifeline she had left. If Wayne had admitted to the affair, he would have shared the blame. The press would have targeted him as the aggressor, but by swearing that he was innocent, he legally isolated Gail. He ensured that the entire narrative shifted. Gail was no longer the tragic casualty of a broken marriage. In the eyes of the press and the public, she became the delusional, predatory homewrecker who had actively pursued an innocent, honorable man. He threw her over the side of the ship to lighten his own load. He watched the woman who had relied on him for emotional protection be mentally and publicly destroyed by his wife's lawyers, and he did not offer a single syllable of defense. He watched her hands shake. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, and he remained silent. This was the true, unfiltered nature of Hollywood masculinity. The man who built an entire career pretending to be a fearless protector of women on the silver screen was exposed as a corporate coward in real life. He hid behind his legal counsel. He weaponized his own pristine reputation to crush a sick, defenseless woman. He preserved his box office appeal. He secured his future, built entirely on the shattered remains of a woman he used and discarded. The image of Gail Russell exiting the courthouse that afternoon became an iconic piece of tragic Hollywood iconography. She was a broken shell of a human being. The flashbulbs captured a woman actively experiencing a nervous breakdown, weeping uncontrollably, physically supported by her handlers as she stumbled toward a waiting car. That photograph was wired to newspapers across the country. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of her public degradation. The photograph of her collapse landed on the desks of the executives at Republic Pictures. This was the moment the studio executed their ultimate betrayal. Republic Pictures had forced Gail to take the stand to protect John Wayne. And the moment she fulfilled her purpose and took the bullet for him, they discarded her. Years prior, as she approached her late 20s, the maintenance costs of the addiction they engineered began outstripping her commercial value. To terminate her legally, the studio weaponized the morals clause against her escalating alcoholism. The men who signed the termination papers citing her public scandal were the exact same men who had ordered their handlers to pour vodka down her throat a decade earlier, and the same men who ordered her into the courtroom. When the poison began to visibly degrade the product, they fired her for for being poisoned. By the time Esperanza Baur's subpoena dragged her into the light in 1953, Gail Russell had no studio protection left to shield her. The legal war had concluded and the battlefield was cleared. The distribution of power and consequences was stark, brutal, and entirely predictable. Esperanza Baur emerged victorious, executing a financial bloodbath. She walked out of the Los Angeles courthouse having successfully gutted Wayne's empire. She extracted an astronomical settlement, stripping him of massive wealth, properties, and securing a vast portion of his generating assets. She neutralized a rival, crippled her cheating husband financially, and retreated to Mexico with millions. John Wayne did not emerge unscathed. The legal slaughter devastated the American hero's finances. Wayne's perjury insulated his public brand, but his personal accounts were decimated. He was forced to scramble back to the sound stages, churning out westerns, The Searchers, Rio Bravo, The Alamo, not merely for legacy, but out of desperate financial necessity to rebuild the fortune his wife had legally seized. He survived the scandal, but he spent the next decade working relentlessly just to pay the humiliating price of his betrayal. And Gail Russell was left with nothing. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom had closed and the iron gates of Republic Pictures were locked. The vacuum of absolute isolation swallowed her. She was not merely unemployed, she was corporately excommunicated. The morals clause invoked by Republic Pictures functioned as an invisible industry-wide guillotine. In the tightly controlled oligopoly of the 1950s studio system, an actress fired for moral turpitude became radioactive. No rival executive at Paramount, Warner Brothers, or MGM would dare offer a contract to a woman publicly branded as an unstable alcoholic and a homewrecker. Furthermore, the scandal involved John Wayne, the most bankable, politically connected male star in the nation. To hire Gail Russell was to insult John Wayne. No studio head was willing to risk access to the industry's primary cash cow to save a damaged B-movie actress. She was 29 years old, and her viability as a commercial asset was permanently extinguished. The blacklist in the 1950s Hollywood studio system was not a physical document. It was not a piece of paper pinned to a bulletin board in the executive dining room. The blacklist was an acoustic reality. It was the sudden, absolute, and terrifying silence of a telephone that stopped ringing. For Gail Russell, the transition from a highly managed corporate asset to a quarantined exile was instantaneous. When Republic Pictures severed her contract, they did not just revoke her weekly paycheck. They stripped her of the vast, invisible infrastructure that had kept her alive. Since she was a teenager, Gail's entire physical existence had been dictated by the studio apparatus. Handlers woke her up. Drivers transported her to the lot. Wardrobe assistants dressed her. Directors told her where to stand. And, most crucially, the studio mechanics managed her alcohol intake, dispensing just enough liquor to suppress her severe clinical anxiety without completely incapacitating her. She had never been required to navigate the adult world autonomously. She was a dependent ward of the corporation. Abandoned by the industry, her existence contracted to the stagnant shadows of a West Los Angeles apartment. The agonizing irony of her new existence was absolute. The camera phobia that had triggered her initial descent into addiction was no longer a daily threat because the cameras had been packed away. The directors were gone. The blinding arc lamps were turned off, but the chemical dependency manufactured by the studio was permanent. The executives had stripped away her livelihood, her status, and her dignity, but they left her with the exact coping mechanism they had actively prescribed. Without the rigorous 14-hour shooting schedules to structure her waking hours, without handlers to manage her intake, the drinking mutated. It accelerated from a functional, corporate-mandated anesthetic into a terminal disease. The vodka was no longer a lubricant required to get her through a scene of dialogue. It became the only barrier between her conscious mind and the crushing weight of her public humiliation. It became the only reliable mechanism to silence the repetitive, intrusive memories of the Los Angeles courtroom, the blinding flashbulbs, and the staggering betrayal of John Wayne. In the mid-1950s, the Los Angeles Press Corps operated with the ruthless efficiency of a vulture syndicate. The era of the heavily sanitized, studio-controlled fan magazines was ending. The rise of aggressive tabloid journalism, spearheaded by publications like Confidential magazine, had changed the rules of engagement. The public was no longer satisfied with curated portraits of aristocratic domestic bliss. They wanted blood. They wanted to see the gods of the silver screen bleed, stumble, and fall. Gail Russell provided them with prime material. The media did not view her as a victim of corporate medical abuse. They did not investigate the studio executives who had initially supplied her with alcohol. They framed her entirely through the lens of moral failure. She was the fallen woman, the homewrecker, who had tried to destroy an American hero's marriage and was now paying the psychological price. The press monitored her descent with a clinical forensic fascination. They waited outside her apartment building. They paid off bartenders and liquor store clerks for tips on her movements. And when the inevitable public collapses occurred, the photographers were always present, their flash powder cameras ready to document the wreckage. The arrests began to accumulate, forming a grim public ledger of her deterioration. She was not arrested for grand crimes. She was arrested for the messy, dangerous, and pathetic infractions of a severe alcoholic losing motor function. She was pulled over for driving under the influence. She rammed her car into parked vehicles. In one highly publicized incident, she drove her convertible directly into the glass front of a Los Angeles coffee shop, shattering the storefront and pinning a janitor against the counter. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at these scenes, they did not find a glamorous movie star. They found a woman in a state of severe intoxication, often disoriented, weeping, and physically unable to stand unassisted. The resultant police booking photos, the mug shots, were immediately leaked to the press and printed on the front pages of the local dailies. These images were weaponized against her. The public consumed them with a cruel, moralizing satisfaction. The photographs documented a terrifying physical transformation. The haunting, melancholic beauty that Herbert Yates had commodified, the flawless bone structure that had generated millions of dollars at the box office, was being erased. Alcoholism is not a glamorous disease. It is a brutal, systematic dismantling of the human anatomy. The sheer volume of liquor required to numb Gail's trauma was destroying her liver, leading to severe fluid retention and facial bloating. The malnutrition, because advanced alcoholics consume their calories through liquor rather than food, left her hair thinning and her skin pale and drawn. The eyes that had once captivated audiences now stared out from the mugshots with the unmistakable hollowed-out vacancy of a woman waiting for the end. She was dragged back into the courtroom system, this time not as a co-respondent in a divorce, but as a criminal defendant facing DUI charges. The geography was the same: the wood-paneled walls, the judge's bench, the gallery packed with reporters. But the context was far more pathetic. She stood before the judges, trembling, pleading guilty, paying fines she could barely afford, and listening to lectures on morality and civic responsibility. The media covered these hearings as a sideshow. They contrasted her current bloated and terrified appearance with archive photos of her in her prime. They ran headlines lamenting the tragic fall of a Hollywood beauty. They treated her addiction as a personal failing, a lack of willpower, completely ignoring the fact that she was actively dying from an occupational hazard inflicted upon her by her former employers. While Gail Russell was being subjected to this relentless public autopsy, the architect of her legal slaughter was achieving unparalleled cultural supremacy. John Wayne did not look back. He did not visit the Los Angeles County Jail to post her bail. He did not anonymously fund a stay at a private rehabilitation clinic. He did not deploy a fraction of his massive accumulating wealth to secure her the psychiatric help she desperately needed. He was entirely insulated from her collapse. The press, complicit in the maintenance of his highly profitable myth, rarely mentioned his name in the articles detailing Gail's arrests. He was functionally immune. The 1950s marked the absolute zenith of John Wayne's career. He transitioned from a contracted studio star to a massive corporate entity. He formed his own production company, Batjack Productions. He took control of his own capital. He stopped working for men like Herbert Yates and became the CEO of his own empire. The sickening irony of his trajectory lies in the specific roles he chose to play while Gail was rotting in her apartment. In 1956, Wayne starred in John Ford's masterpiece, The Searchers. He played Ethan Edwards, a hardened, relentless veteran who spends years tracking across the brutal frontier to rescue his vulnerable, kidnapped niece. The entire narrative of the film is built on the concept of unyielding masculine protection. It is a story about a man who will cross deserts, endure blizzards, and kill any threat to save a fragile young woman. The public paid millions of dollars to watch John Wayne play the savior. They watched him stride across Monument Valley, a towering monument to American courage, projecting an aura of absolute safety. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The man who is currently being canonized on celluloid as the ultimate protector of women was the exact same man who had sat in a courtroom a few years earlier and watched his fragile, severely ill co-star be torn apart by lawyers without offering a single word of defense. He had used her, exposed her to his wife's legal crosshairs, and abandoned her the moment she became a liability. John Wayne's on-screen heroism was a highly lucrative corporate fiction. His real-life cowardice was a documented legal fact, but the American public, desperate for symbols of strength in the post-war era, chose the fiction. They bought the ticket. They funded his empire, and the Hollywood machinery ensured that the ugly physical reality of Gail Russell's suffering never interfered with his box office receipts. As Wayne's wealth and power expanded, Gail's world contracted to the dimensions of her living room. The isolation was absolute. The Hollywood ecosystem is notoriously brutal to the discarded. When an actor loses their contract and their commercial value, the entourage vanishes. The invitations stop. The friends who happily drank her liquor when she was a leading lady stopped answering her calls. She became a pariah. She was too famous to exist quietly in obscurity, but too damaged to be employed. She was trapped in the purgatory of the blacklist. In the late 1950s, there was a brief, cruel illusion of a comeback. A few independent producers, looking to capitalize on her tragic notoriety, offered her small roles in low-budget films. She appeared in a minor Western titled 7 Men from Now in 1956 and a cheap crime drama called The Tattered Dress in 1957. These were not acts of corporate mercy, they were acts of exploitation. The producers hired her specifically because her name still carried the morbid weight of the scandal. They paid her a fraction of her former salary. On the sets of these final films, the physical toll of her addiction was impossible to hide. The camera, once her greatest terror, now captured the undeniable evidence of her destruction. The makeup artist had to work for hours to hide the bloating in her face and the broken capillaries in her skin. The directors had to shoot around her trembling hands. She struggled to remember her lines. The neurological damage inflicted by years of heavy drinking had degraded her cognitive functions. She was no longer the haunting beauty of Republic pictures. She was a ghost walking through her own scenes. The studios had extracted the final ounces of labor from her failing body and then discarded her again. The minor paychecks from these B-movies did not fund a new life. They simply funded the liquor store. By the dawn of 1960, the final phase of her physical breakdown commenced. The cycle of arrests, hospitalizations, and relapses accelerated. The Los Angeles courts, exhausted by her repeated DUI offenses, ordered her into mandatory psychiatric observation. She was locked in a psychiatric ward, subjected to the primitive, often brutal addiction treatments of the era. But a few weeks in a state-run facility cannot cure a trauma that was systematically engineered by a multi-million-dollar corporation and sealed by a public legal slaughter. The moment she was released, she returned to the empty apartment. She returned to the silence, and she returned to the bottle. There were no more comeback attempts. There were no more court appearances. There was only the slow, meticulous, and completely unglamorous process of a human organ shutting down. The liver is a resilient mechanism capable of regenerating and processing immense amounts of toxins, but it has a terminal limit. Gail Russell was rapidly approaching that limit. She stopped leaving the apartment. She stopped eating solid food. The malnutrition compounded the effects of the alcohol, accelerating the breakdown of her muscle, tissue, and immune system. She was starving to death in the middle of one of the wealthiest cities on earth, surrounded by empty glass bottles, completely erased from the industry that had created her. The countdown to the final inevitable conclusion had begun. The Hollywood machinery had successfully transferred all the risk, all the guilt, and all the physical damage onto the weakest asset on the board. Esperanza Baur had her money. John Wayne had his legacy. Republic Pictures had balanced its ledgers. The trap was empty. The victim had been consumed. All that remained was the final clinical verification of her death. The end of a human life inside the Hollywood ecosystem is rarely a glamorous event. When the cameras stop rolling and the studio protection is revoked, The death of a discarded asset is not orchestrated with soaring orchestral music or dramatic final speeches. It is a slow, silent, and fundamentally biological failure occurring behind a locked door in a cheap apartment. By the summer of 1961, the physical reality of Gail Russell's existence had contracted to the square footage of her living room in West Los Angeles. The woman who had once starred opposite the biggest icons of the Golden Age, whose face had been plastered on billboards across the country, was now completely incapacitated by the very mechanism her employers had used to control her. The severe addiction fostered during her studio years eventually overpowered her failing biological system. Gail Russell was experiencing this systemic organ failure entirely alone. She was 36 years old. She had no husband, no children, and no remaining connection to the industry that had consumed her youth. The isolation was absolute. The telephone, which had stopped ringing with job offers years ago, was now completely silent. She had alienated the few remaining friends who had tried and failed to intervene in her addiction. She was existing on a diet consisting almost exclusively of vodka. The severe malnutrition accelerated the muscle atrophy. She was wasting away, a physical manifestation of the industry's consumption. She was starving in the shadow of the Hollywood Hills. The exact timeline of her final days is undocumented because no one was there to witness it. It was a private, agonizing descent into a terminal coma. She did not die in a hospital bed surrounded by medical professionals. She died on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by the physical remnants of the cure Republic Pictures had prescribed her. On August 26, 1961, the silence emanating from Gail Russell's apartment was broken by the mundane reality of neighbors noticing a foul odor. It was the unmistakable smell of decomposition. The police were called to the scene. When the officers forced entry into the apartment, they did not find a cinematic tragedy. They found a crime scene of corporate negligence. The apartment was littered with empty liquor bottles. The physical decay of the living space mirrored the physical decay of the woman who inhabited it. Gail Russell's body was found on the floor. She had been dead for several days before anyone noticed she was missing. The isolation the studio system had imposed upon her in life was maintained perfectly in her death. The coroner's arrival initiated the final clinical assessment of her value. Her body was transported to the Los Angeles County morgue, where she was subjected to a standard autopsy. The resulting medical report stripped away the final layers of the Hollywood myth. It was blunt, objective, and devoid of sentimentality. The official cause of death was acute liver damage, compounded by severe malnutrition. The coroner noted the extensive cirrhosis, the physical evidence of years of unmanaged heavy alcohol abuse. She had literally drank herself into organ failure while simultaneously starving to death. Her biological system had simply surrendered under the accumulated weight of the clinical anxiety she was born with, the alcohol the studio had supplied to manage it, and the total crushing social isolation inflicted upon her by the divorce courts. The release of the autopsy report triggered a brief hypocritical spasm of media coverage. The Los Angeles Press, the same institution that had documented her courtroom humiliation with predatory glee, the same reporters who had published her bloated, terrified mugshots to sell newspapers, suddenly adopted a tone of pious mourning. They ran headlines lamenting the tragic end of a broken star. They published retrospectives on her brief, shining career in the 1940s. They framed her death as a cautionary tale about the pressures of fame and the weakness of the human spirit. They entirely omitted the mechanics of her destruction. No major publication launched an investigative report into the executives at Republic Pictures, who had initially supplied a terrified teenager with alcohol to keep their production schedules on track. No editorial board questioned the morals clause that allowed a studio to fire an employee for developing the exact addiction they had engineered. No journalist pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of John Wayne, the American hero who had thrown her to the wolves to protect his box office receipts. The media narrative was designed to protect the institutions. It was easier and far more profitable to blame the victim. The narrative stated that Gail Russell was too fragile for Hollywood, that she lacked the moral fortitude to survive the pressures of stardom. She was written off as a weak woman who made bad choices. The system that had systematically dismantled her was absolved of all responsibility. The funeral arrangements reflected her diminished status. There was no grand public memorial service. The titans of the industry did not gather to pay their respects. The studio executives who had profited from her labor did not send lavish floral arrangements. The actors she had starred opposite, the leading men whose careers she had helped elevate, were conspicuously absent. John Wayne did not attend the funeral. He was currently in production on another massive multi-million-dollar Western. He did not issue a public statement of condolence. He maintained the absolute, legally calculated silence he had established during the Esperanza Baur trial. He had excised Gail Russell from his narrative in 1953, and her death in 1961 did not alter his corporate strategy. He remained the unyielding symbol of masculine courage, completely insulated from the reality of the woman who died on the floor because of his cowardice. Gail Russell was buried quietly in the Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery in North Hollywood. The ceremony was sparsely attended, a final grim confirmation of her total erasure from the industry. She was lowered into the ground, a discontinued product written off the ledger permanently, her death barely registering as a footnote in the vast continuous machinery of the Golden Age. But the silence surrounding her grave cannot bury the historical truth of her execution. The death of Gail Russell is not a tragedy of individual weakness. It is an indictment. It stands as the ultimate chilling proof of the precise lethal mechanics of the Hollywood studio system. It exposes an industry that operated as a human strip mine, a corporation that extracted every ounce of commercial value from a human being and discarded the toxic remains without a shred of legal or moral accountability. Her demise provides the irrefutable evidence that you do not need a weapon to commit a murder in Hollywood. You do not need to pull a trigger or administer a lethal injection. You only need an ironclad contract. You need a compliant, aggressive legal system. And you need an absolute chilling absence of empathy. Republic Pictures initiated the slaughter. They utilized alcohol to bypass her psychological boundaries. Extracting maximum labor, they forced her onto the witness stand to act as a meat shield for their most valuable asset, then immediately fired her for the damage she sustained. Esperanza Baur accelerated the slaughter. She utilized the divorce courts to publicly shred Gail's dignity and eliminate a rival. She proved that the legal system is a weapon of mass personal destruction, a tool that the wealthy use to execute their enemies with absolute impunity. And John Wayne finalized the slaughter. He used his immense cultural power and elite legal representation to shield himself, leaving a sick, defenseless woman totally exposed to the blast radius of his own infidelity. He proved that the cinematic hero is a manufactured illusion, a corporate brand designed to sell tickets, while the man beneath the cowboy hat is capable of profound life-destroying cowardice. They all took a piece of her. The studio took her youth, her neurological health, and her commercial value. The wife took her reputation, her dignity, and her financial future. The hero took her sanity, her last shred of hope, and her faith in human decency. When there was nothing left of commercial or personal value to extract, they collectively discarded the hollow shell. They locked the gates, they turned off the lights, and they let the chemicals finish the job. The grave of Gail Russell was barely covered with earth before the Hollywood machinery initiated the final phase of her destruction. Physical death was not enough. To protect the multi-million-dollar investments tied to John Wayne and the reputation of the studio system, the industry executed a meticulously coordinated campaign of historical erasure. In the decades that followed her demise, Gail Russell was systematically deleted from the official narrative of the Golden Age. Her films were rarely revived. Her name was omitted from the retrospective documentaries celebrating the history of Republic Pictures. When her name was mentioned in the trade papers or biographies, it was relegated to a cautionary footnote, a brief patronizing anecdote about a weak, tragic girl who simply lacked the fortitude to survive the glamour of the motion picture business. This erasure was not an accident. It was a corporate necessity. To acknowledge the actual mechanics of Gail Russell's death would require the industry to admit that the studio system operated as a predatory cartel. It would require the public to recognize that the studios functioned as unlicensed dispensaries, administering heavy depressants to terrified employees to maximize shooting schedules. It would require an admission that the morals clause, the supposed bedrock of Hollywood decency, was actually a weapon of financial terrorism used exclusively to liquidate vulnerable women while shielding powerful men. The application of the morals clause in the Gail Russell case remains one of the most glaring examples of corporate asymmetry in the history of American entertainment. The clause was designed to terminate any employee who brought public scandal or moral disgrace to the studio. During the divorce trial of Esperanza Baur, the scandal was generated by an adulterous affair between two contract players. John Wayne was a married man. He was the offending party who had violated the sanctity of his marriage vows. He was the one whose domestic life had erupted into a highly publicized, scandalous legal circus. By the strict definition of the morals clause, John Wayne was entirely in breach of his contract. But the morals clause was a one-way mirror. It was never intended to regulate the behavior of the men who generated the primary capital. It was an instrument of patriarchal control designed to police the bodies and the reputations of the female workforce. John Wayne's contract was not terminated. He was not suspended. He was not fined a single dollar. His moral transgressions were actively covered up by the studio fixers. His perjury on the witness stand was ignored by the press, and his career was aggressively promoted. The studio system determined that male infidelity was an acceptable operational byproduct, but female vulnerability was a fireable offense. Republic Pictures fired Gail Russell for the crime of being publicly destroyed by their leading man. As Gail's memory was buried, John Wayne's mythology expanded to monopolize the cultural landscape of the United States. He transcended the status of a mere actor and became a political and ideological institution. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he functioned as the ultimate emblem of American conservatism, the unwavering symbol of law, order, and traditional masculine valor. He starred in films that celebrated the righteous application of force. He advised presidents. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the nation. The public worshiped the man on the screen, the hero who would ride through hell to save a defenseless woman. They willfully ignored the man in the courtroom, the coward who had watched a defenseless woman be torn apart by his wife's attorneys and refused to speak her name. The culture rewarded the cowardice. The industry monetized the hypocrisy. Wayne died in 1979 as a national icon. His immense wealth and unassailable legacy built on a foundation of discarded human collateral. The final autopsy of the Republic Pictures triad reveals a perfectly calibrated machine of extraction. Esperanza Baur utilized the courts to extract a massive financial settlement and eliminate a rival, proving that the legal system is simply a weapon that the wealthy use to execute their enemies with impunity. John Wayne extracted the physical and emotional labor of a vulnerable woman, discarded her to protect his box office brand, and extracted millions of dollars from a public desperate for a hero. Republic Pictures extracted a decade of grueling labor from a severely ill teenager, utilized alcohol to bypass her neurological limits, and extracted themselves from all liability the moment she collapsed. Gail Russell paid the entire cost of the transaction with her life. She was a casualty of a business model that viewed human beings as depreciating industrial machinery. Her death proved that a studio could medically compromise an actor, work them to the point of biological failure, and throw them onto the street without facing a single lawsuit, a labor board inquiry, or a police investigation. The Screen Actors Guild did not intervene to save her. The medical establishment did not investigate the studio doctors who supplied the liquor. The system protected the system.